A big story here in Alberta this week, especially when it comes to politics, is Nenshi's huge victory as the new leader of the Alberta NDP. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent of the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, in the end, it wasn't even close, with Nenshi seeing around 86% of the vote. Were you surprised that he received around 67,000 votes?
I think I was surprised by the size of that overall number, but maybe not surprised that he received such a large proportion of the votes. About 67,000 votes, that's a huge number of votes. When Jason Kenney won, he got about 35,000 votes. And when Danielle Smith won, I think she had 32 or 33,000 votes. So this is an absolutely overwhelming endorsement from the New Democratic Party members. And there's a couple possible explanations for that. It was less acrimonious, certainly, than some of the UCP leadership debates. Fewer issues on the table than when Jason Kenney became leader back in 2018 or 2019 after the merger and all that. So, it's a pretty different situation in some ways, but an absolutely overwhelming endorsement from the party. I think the most votes a party leader has got in a leadership contest in Alberta, dating back at least to 2006, probably earlier than that. So this says a couple things. First of all, it gives Nenshi, a very, very solid sort of endorsement of his leadership. But it also suggests, or rather confirms, or is another bit of information about what we already knew, which is that there's been a huge increase in the NDP membership during this leadership race. The party is almost certainly the largest it's ever been. It's grown from between 16 and 30,000 members to perhaps upwards of 80,000 members, I think is what the party was saying at one point. And that you've had 67,000 vote for Nenshi, and then 2,000 or 3,000 here and there for the other candidates, for maybe a total of 75,000 votes. That also means you've got a huge number of activated, involved, and curious members, which is a really important thing to have going into the next few years in opposition, thinking about looking ahead to that next election.
Was it the Nenshi camp, however, that brought in a lot of the new members?
It does seem to have been sort of overwhelmingly Nenshi supporters. That's a good thing for him personally, in the sense that he's going to have a loyal base when they get to policy discussions and things like that at the convention. He might not have as much trouble as he may have otherwise. It also, if these people stay engaged, stay enthusiastic, it also means that he's going to have volunteers, he's going to have people knocking on doors. And of course, depending how many of these people he brought in from Calgary versus new members he signed up from elsewhere in the province, that also means that he's going to have a ready base of support within Calgary, which is going to be sort of the all-important battleground most likely in the next election. These people can be doing the things I just mentioned, knocking on doors, fundraising, putting signs in their yard, and sort of helping to sculpt or shift perceptions that Calgarians are going to have of his leadership.
Could we potentially see some party infighting, though, right now? Because I know many political pundits believe that Nenshi's more of a centrist, and some within the Alberta NDP lean more heavily to the left. So could there be some potential friction there with his leadership?
Yeah, there certainly could be. I think we probably won't see much of that for a while. I think we'll see some of that at next spring's convention when it comes down to the nitty-gritty of developing party platform commitments. That's at the point where you might see some of those schisms over various policies or moving to the center on something. So yeah, I do think there could be some of that friction. Now, the question, of course, is what's the overriding motivating factor for NDP members right now? And it's probably defeating Danielle Smith in the UCP. So are you going to see that much infighting before the next election? It's certainly possible. I think we're going to hear about it, but I suspect that party members are going to rally behind their leader because there is this all-consuming, most important of all goals, which is to win the next election. At that point, I would imagine seeing some friction, perhaps more public, perhaps some of the similar stuff to what happened to Jason Kenney when he was premier. But, I just think that unifying, motivating force is probably just so powerful that we won't see that much of it for a little while.
So Nenshi as well, Tyler, says they're looking into the potential of severing ties with the federal NDP, which many would argue is a pretty good idea.
Yeah, the federal NDP and the Alberta NDP are, of course, in disagreement on a lot of major issues. The sort of classic example of that is when the federal Liberals bought the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion when it looked like it was going to fail. Rachel Notley supported that at the time, and Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the federal NDP, thought it was, a terribly anti-environment decision and did not support it. And the federal NDP is presently propping up the federal Liberals government, and the Alberta NDP is sort of tied to that in some way. And obviously, that's a very, very unpopular government in the province. So, this relationship between the two parties is, if you didn't know it existed on paper, you almost wouldn't know it existed at all, because there has been such areas of disagreement, and Jagmeet Singh is not, flying in regularly to join the party leader at rallies and things like that. So there already is sort of this separation in many ways on policy, on positions on various issues. So this is the debate is going to happen. It is probably also going to be acrimonious, because there are longtime Alberta NDP members who are believers in this relationship and believers in the federal NDP as well. And so that divorce for them could be uncomfortable or something they don't like. But on the flip side, getting away from that sort of symbolic relationship with a party that's supporting a government that isn't very popular in Alberta, you can see, I guess, why Nenshi thinks this is a good idea, and why people who think it's a good idea think that way.
And it could create more of that infighting or friction like we talked about here.
It could, yeah.
Tyler, big news in our city, and that Lethbridge West MLA Shannon Phillips is giving up her seat on July the 1st. It's the only seat the NDP holds outside of Edmonton and Calgary. Now, some thought it might be a riding where Nenshi could run, but you don't really see it that way.
No, and he's been asked about it, and he's basically said, look, I think it's important that a party leader, if they're elected to represent a constituency, should in fact spend some time in that constituency. So it's unlikely, I think, that he, at this point anyways, is going to want to represent a riding a couple hours away from where his home base is. There are, of course, all sorts of other questions about where he's going to run. Is someone going to step aside? How safe of a battle is it going to be for him to run in that seat? But it does seem unlikely to me that he's going to run for Shannon Phillips' seat in Lethbridge West. It is, however, a big deal. Shannon Phillips has been around for a long time. She was a senior member of Rachel Notley's cabinet. As you said, she represents one riding outside of Edmonton and Calgary for the New Democrats. And one of the things that Nenshi is going to need to do, in addition to shoring up support in Edmonton and Calgary and winning more seats in Calgary, is to try and expand the party's base, the party's representation a little bit further beyond the two big cities. And so there is going to be a by-election at some point. I think the next 6 months is when the rules say it has to be held. And that is going to be a bit of a test of Nenshi and the new NDP's strategy. Can they hang on to a seat that Shannon Phillips has held for 10-ish years? And if they don't hold on to it, what does that say about their chances for expanding the party's representation outside of the two big cities? So it's going to be very, very interesting, and the end of an era for sure for a very long-serving NDP member.
So this could be a wonderful opportunity for the UCP, kind of like what we saw in Toronto St. Paul's recently, where the Conservatives won in a Liberal stronghold.
Yeah, absolutely. The UCP, I think, will probably throw everything they can at it. That's not totally uncommon in a by-election, but certainly there's a real symbolic victory for either side in this one. So I would expect that to be a pretty hard-fought campaign, potentially some fairly prominent candidates that they're running in that race, and a little bit of a microcosm and referendum on the two leaders playing out in that riding. So that one will be very interesting to watch when it happens.
Tyler, Premier Smith and the province have said that they're going to opt out of the federal government's dental care plan. The plan would see those with dental coverage and who earn less than $90,000 a year be eligible for federal coverage. Did Smith really explain her reasoning why?
Well, the idea is that Alberta already has its own health benefits that include dental, and that the Alberta government would rather have the money that the federal government is setting aside for this, take it themselves and put it into their own program. This is the same argument they made on the pharmacare stuff. They said they're going to do the same thing, that Alberta already has a robust pharmacare program for people who don't have private insurance, and they might as well just continue building up that program instead of opting into the federal one. This actually, it dates back a long time, but this was one of the things that the Fair Deal panel back in, what would that have been, 2019? 2020 maybe, had actually recommended. They recommended that the Alberta government try and maintain some distance from the feds by opting out of some of these funding agreements, cost sharing agreements, and bolster their own programming instead. Now, that's very easy for the premier to say. Becomes a little bit trickier if the federal government says, well, what makes you think you should get that money if you're not participating? It certainly gets a little more difficult if they start getting a lot of feedback from voters. So it wouldn't totally surprise me if there was a shift in that stance, but certainly as it stands now, they are not participating in either of these cost sharing agreements and are hoping to get that money to put into Alberta's programming.
The province also announced that it will not go the route of creating government auto insurance, Tyler. Alberta has some of the most expensive auto insurance rates here in the country. I just had mine renewed and it went up by quite a bit. Wouldn't this have been kind of a no-brainer for the government to make auto insurance more affordable?
Yeah, it's weird things are happening with affordability generally right now because the government is not doing very much on it. You'll remember a year or so ago, there were a whole slew of programs and benefits announced to help sort of defray the affordability crisis. And I think almost all of those programs have expired. There was a one-time payment to support if you have kids. There's a one-time payment to help fund that. And so the Alberta government has just not done that much lately on affordability. And it's a bit of I don't know if it's a blind spot or just something they don't think is that big of a deal politically, but they just haven't done very much on it. And this is an example of one of those things where they've not really made any big decisions about what to do. What they have said, as you said, is they're not going to do a public auto insurance program similar to what BC or Manitoba or Saskatchewan have. And the reason for that basically is they looked at the price tag. I think the government said it was about $3 billion and said, well, that's way too much money to get involved. So they are exploring other things such as a no-fault auto insurance scheme, something that would, keep some of this stuff from going to court, which would bring down some of the costs to insurers. There was a rate cap back in November 2023, but that actually doesn't appear to have done much of anything. Insurance costs still went up by about 5.5% for Albertans. There's just a report released this week on that. Bit of an odd situation, and you're right that it does seem like a no-brainer to have done something. Whether public auto insurance is that something is a little bit harder to say, but certainly not a debate that's going away anytime soon. I mean, I had mine renewed the other day as well, and spent part of the day yesterday on the phone, wondering why the heck I'm paying more than I did when I was a 17-year-old with my first car. So it is what it is.
That's right. That's what my mother used to say too. Now, Tyler, Premier Smith says her government will fight changes to the Federal Competition Act that critics say limits the ability of oil and gas companies to really talk about their environmental efforts.
This is a really confusing one, and it's not confusing because the law itself is confusing. It's confusing because people keep getting it confused with a private member's bill from Ontario NDP MP Charlie Angus. This is actually, it goes way back to like the budget implementation bill of 2022 or 2023. And all it was is it's changes to the Competition Act, basically. And basically says that if a company is going to advertise its environmental bona fides, they need to be able to prove it. If they say their emissions went down 30% this year, they need to be able to prove that with whatever science they have. And the problem that has been identified by industry groups, by the Alberta government, is that the law as it's written now calls for sort of science based on a, quote, internationally recognized methodology or something like that. So what does that mean? It's pretty vague. And so that's why you've seen Pathways Alliance, the sort of group of, I think it's the 6th largest oil and gas producers in Alberta, sort of in this association to get the oil industry to net zero. They've pulled all of their stuff from their website because they're not sure if they're running afoul of this law. They're not sure exactly what the law is setting out. So it's a very confusing situation on a couple fronts. But the Alberta government obviously sees this as a huge problem, saying that environmental or energy companies can't talk about what they're doing for the environment. They're calling it draconian. They're saying it limits freedom of speech and limits advertising and things like that. So it's become this small thing that was in the budget implementation bill a year or whatever later that is now turned into a bit of a crisis. And essentially means that if someone doesn't like what a company is saying about their environmental record, they could go to the competition commissioner and complain about it, and that would start sort of the hearings process. But obviously, controversial for fairly obvious and straightforward reasons in Alberta.
Hey, before we let you go, let's chit-chat a bit about the War Room for just a moment here. It's an initiative launched by Jason Kenney to brand itself as the Canadian Energy Centre, pushing back against environmentalists. Tyler, what's become of the War Room since Daniel Smith became Premier?
Well, it's kind of languished. It never really was as influential or prominent as I think probably Jason Kenney had envisioned it being. People probably mainly remember it for the time that it went after that Netflix children's movie, Bigfoot Family, which was just a sort of a bizarre little fight that cropped up a few years ago. But it's essentially been disbanded. The staffers that have worked for it have kind of been pulled into, I think it's the Intergovernmental Affairs Office. Now, they're still going to be doing research and producing content sort of under the branding of Canadian Energy Centre, but it doesn't seem to exist, or it will cease to exist as sort of an independent sort of arm's length entity of government. And Tom Olson, the guy in charge of it, does appear to have gotten the boot. And he'll get to enjoy his severance for the next few months. So a strange end to what at one point seemed like it was going to be a pretty big part of the Kenney government, and then just ended up being this weird sideshow that no one totally understood and no one took totally seriously. So a bit of an ignominious ending for the Alberta War Room.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks again for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.